In this video, we will explore a new technique that is painting trees using scrap watercolor paper. I will break this watercolor painting into simple, easy to follow steps so you can paint along with me. So join me as we create this serene and beautiful winter scene using watercolors. The sketch needed for this painting is provided here. You can copy it and proceed to step 1. The first step is to paint the sky starting from where the bottom of the house meets the ground. For this background, I am using a light wash of Indian yellow and I am using wet on dry technique. Be careful not to paint over the snow-covered cottages as you work on the sky. In step 2, we will paint the distant trees using Payne's Grey while the sky area is still wet. You can notice that I'm painting just above the ground level, slightly above the bottom edge of the background. Once again, be careful not to paint on the roof of the cottages. As I don't want any hard edges at the bottom of the background, I soften them with a wet brush. Then I wet the entire area for the foreground. We are going to paint the foreground using Payne's Grey. I start by painting lines from the left, angled slightly downward. As I move towards the center, the lines become more vertical. Then as I continue to the right, the lines gradually slant again, becoming horizontal straight lines at the far right. Here the lines illustrate the angle of my strokes, making it easy to follow. The shadow we paint in the foreground gradually fades as it moves away from the viewer into the distance. Next, I sprinkle salt onto the wet foreground to create texture. Once the paper is completely dry, we will paint the tree trunks using a piece of scrap watercolor paper. I cut a small piece of scrap paper and also on my palette I mixed raw umber with a bit of Payne's Grey to create an interesting brown shade. I dip the scrap paper into the paint and I drag it across the watercolor paper on which I am painting the winter scene to create the texture for tree trunks. I recommend practicing this technique before starting your painting as each paper behaves differently. If you find that a long piece of scrap paper doesn't work well, try using a small piece of scrap watercolor paper to paint the tree trunks and create interesting texture. Next, I'm using a light value of the same mix to paint the shadows of the tree trunks. On my palette, I mix indigo with raw umber to create a more concentrated mixture compared to the previous one. Because the tree trunks I painted earlier are farther away, but these new tree trunks are closer to the viewer, so I paint them with a concentrated mix. Now I'm using a small piece of scrap paper to paint the tree trunk. This scrap paper watercolor technique is incredibly useful for adding unique and interesting texture to tree trunks in your painting. By simply varying the consistency of the paint, you can create a sense of depth and dimension, making the painting more dynamic and realistic. Next, I add shadows to the trees using a light value of the same mix. Step 5 is painting the houses. We don't paint the roofs, we focus on the walls instead. For the first house, I use raw umber. For the small house that I'm painting now, I'm using indigo pigment. I want the walls of the cottages to appear soft and natural without any hard edges. To achieve this, I use a wet brush to gently blend it with the snow-covered area. Next, I'm painting the house at the back using Payne's Gray. I'm using same Payne's Gray to paint the cottage, which is at the right side of the paper. With a wet brush, I blend the wall of the cottage with the snow-covered area. Next, I use Indian yellow, a shade similar to light orange, to add a point of interest to this painting. After applying the paint, I use a clean wet brush to gently blend it into the snow for a seamless transition. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more watercolor painting tutorials. See you in the next video. Until then, take care and bye bye from Prema.